that virtually any action that we can imagine can have a spatial coordinate. Yet, when we think of space, it's mainly a steady image which comes to our mind, either a landscape or an interior. There are static visions of a solid reality. But spaces can eventually be manipulated by its inhabitants. But is there more to be said about how spaces can also interfere back with the humans? So what we want to question is whether this perceived immobility of the material surroundings can still speak to our senses implicitly, and so understanding how they shape our feelings, actions, and entertain us in these conversations. So today we will approach these topics of the intersection of human beings and their surroundings and try to discuss and understand how at the neural level these dynamics occur, and then understand how that might also kind of have repercussion on well-being, cognition in general. To continue on, how we can also think about interventions that could change space in order to make it more friendly for the people that have to interact with it. All the challenges that can take place when thinking about space. And of course, we invite you to also think about any possible questions, or if you want to share any of your doubts or curiosity, you can definitely do that. We have some couples of minutes just reserved for that at the middle, in the middle of the discussion, and also at the end. So feel free to raise your hands, and we're gonna come to you.
Okay, this is good. Because I have trouble hearing you, so I don't know how it is for the people on the back. It's good?
Is it better? Good?
This
good?
is good,
Okay.
I think. It might be your mic.
Now, closer? Yeah, okay.
Okay. To help us uncover these notions, we have three guests with us today. Dr. Rikst van der Veen from the University of Amsterdam. She's part of the Brain and Plasticity Group and the Center for Urban Mental Health. Dr. Matthias Nau, Assistant Professor of Computational Cognition, Cognitive Neuroscience at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And Dr. Frank Surenborg, Professor of Spatial Urban Transformation at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Would you like to add anything to introduce yourselves?
Well, I think that was short, but correct. So actually, this is my home here at Science Park. I'm a neuroscientist, behavioral neuroscientist, and indeed part of the Center for Urban Mental Health, which I will talk about a bit later on. And happy to be here today.
Yeah, maybe to thank you for the introduction. I'm Frank Surenborg. I'm applied professor, I should say, of spatial urban transformation. And in my group, we look at the urban densification and urban renewal of our cities. And that's, of course, a massive undertaking, as we have to build or aim to build many new homes within the existing urban fabric. And that poses a number of questions and challenges, and especially also for the way we create spaces for well-being and for people. And that's, well, what we do in multiple research projects.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thanks so much for organizing this and for having all of us, having me here. My name is Matthias Nau. I'm assistant professor at the VU here in Amsterdam. And I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I work on memory and perception. I use MRI and eye tracking a lot in my work to understand how people perceive space, how they remember space. But that's originally where I come from. But in the past, I work now much more on memory and imagery. And we will see, I think, maybe also in this session that there is that space, in a way, to understand space and how we remember it, that is memory. That has actually a lot to do with imagery and memory, kind of snapshots of different places and how they relate. So I think that's also why I was invited. Right? Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Then I think we can also pick it up from here, and let's try to already give sort of a definition of space, trying to also understand how we should define it, how you define it maybe in your work, and maybe if there's anything that should be added to our like normal understanding of space.
Yeah, so for me, that's actually a surprisingly difficult question, because there's at least two ways in which I could approach that. There's this space that we all intuitively know, right? Let's say this kind of 3D box that we walk around in, and it kind of evolves over time, kind of this 4D thing. And we all have this impression that we all walk around in this shared space, right? All of us, we share that space right now. But there's a completely different definition that in recent years became more important to me, at least, and that is it's a very subjective one, because the space that you experience right now is it's not that box, it's not reality as such. It's the spatial impression of this room, for example, is created by your brain, right? It's any experience is generated by your brain, and that also means that, for example, the way we perceive this layout, this geometry of this room, even the lightness of this room, everything is inherently subjective. We create slightly different spaces in our minds. And I think that is very subjective. So the experience of space is somewhat detached from, or is different from, that kind of physical box that we seem to occupy. So I would say the physical box is one definition, and then actually on the experiential level, on the phenomenological level, space is a construct in our brain, and that is inherently subjective, and that I think has a lot to do also with later with a discussion on architecture, for example, where it's really difficult to, for example, design a space that works for everybody, given that the experience of space and how we orient and everything is so subjective. So maybe that's for later, but maybe you want to add something to the definition?
Yeah, I think, well, because I'm part of the Center of Urban Mental Health, I think I would like to introduce the urban space. And I think I agree with you. Space is also something subjective. But maybe it's nice to put on the first slide. So if we talk about a city, that urbanization is like growing and growing, right? I think globally now, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you have other numbers, around 50% of people, like on a global scale, are now living in cities. And this only increases. So by 2050, this should be already 40% of people living in urban areas, so in cities. And in urban areas, of course, it's booming, it's productive. If you double a city in size, actually what happens is that you get an increase of 50% of productivity per head. So together, we are more productive if we are in a bigger scale. And you have a lot of activities, like culture in the city, but also you have kind of a downside to cities, right? So if you double a city in size, you actually also increase crime rates by 50%, 15%. And diseases spread faster, right? You have all these things, you have more air pollution, noise pollution, but also light pollution nowadays that influences people in their urban space. You have more segregation. People have limited space. You know, if you have a big city, space is limited per capita. You encounter more crowding in a city. So all these factors actually are like stressors to a body. And this is, I think we come across the word stress a lot. We are watching it from a neurological perspective. So together with the individual, right, with your genetics, with your temperament, how you perceive the environment. And my research is more like early life stress and how, because the things that you live early in life actually define how you cope later in life, how you cope with these stresses in the city, how you cope with space. Memory also is important there. So, yeah, I think the thing, it's not one thing in space that will define if you get ill or if you have memory issues or whatever. It's this whole togetherness, let's say, and we try to see if with complex modeling we can try to find, okay, which is an important hub in this space that we can target, also to have these interventions in a city that might be good for people well-being, people health, mental health, physical health. So urban space.
All right. As we are doing applied research, we are focusing on the city as it is produced. So we are looking at the actual design of the new projects that are going on in the next couple of years. And well, you could claim that this particular production of space is actually also, to a large part, the production of society on the longer terms. Because in this moment of the designing space and actually building it, that is the moment that you create a lot of elements which might be at some point also an enabler of the day-to-day livable and livability of people actually living there. And I want to embark a little bit on the kind of challenges that we see in this field, because just to give a little bit of a short background, for the Netherlands, the planning process has been decentralized in 2006 by Minister Dekker, and so that basically meant that we decentralized the whole planning and design process to municipalities. And actually, as it was also accompanied by this neoliberal idea of public-private development, it was decentralized to project level. And what we see in the meantime is that we also tried more and wanted more from each new development. So what you see is that when we talk, we work then also always with design firms, housing corporations, municipalities, and that for each new project, think of the Sluisbuurt, for example, or Zeeburger Eiland, they have to not only create housing, but they also have to make sure that it's some sort of circular, that it has to be at least as energy positive as possible, that it has to implement new kind of mobility solutions, therefore people not taking the car, that it has to be attention for biodiversity, for greening, that it has to be in a mix of buy, rent, and social rent, that it has to be done with participation of the people surrounding it in a situation of a plan area which is a differentiated ownership level. So it's really challenging. And as a result, and that's where it becomes interesting, is that because all these new developments and the amount of program, the amount of housing that we try to solve there is actually much smaller than what you actually need. It means that the architects, urban designers have to come up with new design concepts. So they cannot take like our 19th century streets because it simply doesn't serve what we try to solve there. And that means that we are entering like unprecedented area where we try to build new typologies that we didn't build before. And where we focus on in our research is what kind of design solutions, so what kind of tangible choices they make in order to mitigate the known negative impacts of high density, do they propose, what is actually carried out, and can we understand better of how it actually works, because until it's realized, it's only a nice narrative. And as it goes quite fast, it's very important to have earlier inroads and not just say afterward, right, what we built the last 10 years was actually quite horrible. And that's, I think, what defines space for us is the actual production of the day-to-day environment of people given the current constraints.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understand is that the relationship between the two definitely has a lot of like feedbacks. There's the environment, the physical construct, and then the way people perceive it, and attempt to also shape each other based on that. And what I'm wondering is also, maybe there are like different levels also of like the understanding of it, like the practicalities, like trying to make it visibly also more sustainable, economical for the people that have to live within that. But then we were also talking about like stressors, which are not necessarily so easy to identify. So do you ever kind of approach that package of information on the, like with these two levels, understanding the kind of subconscious and very explicit notions, and how do you think we can kind of make sense of all the implicit stimuli that we receive from space?
I'm not quite sure about the two levels, but what resonated with me right now very much is the word relationship. Because on the most fundamental level, I would say space, if you want to give it a definition, right, it is the set of relationships between things. Let's say in an actual physical space, you could say, well, this glass is this far away from this bottle or something, right? And so if you map out the distances between all of the objects, you essentially get an approximation of what we refer to as space. you could use the same, in cognitive neuroscience that's quite common actually, to talk about different kinds of spaces, even color spaces, for example, where it's the same principle, where it's really about, just how do different mental items relate to each other. That is considered as space, right? And to give a very general definition, at least, when it comes to, I think the second part of your question is really about kind of, really are we separate from the space? Is that what the question is? Like
how
the
we
two
separate from
different
the
levels?
space, and also how are we conditioned by it, like based on what we kind of perceive.
Yeah. So I think my personal opinion is that we are not separate from the environment. I think our very definition is dependent on the environment we find ourselves in. Let's say it's maybe a bit of a morbid example, but if you took away air pressure right now, we wouldn't be sitting here. So we are the very definition of our body, even to the level of our physical integrity, it's only definable within the context of an environment which has a certain spatial spatial definition, a spatial component to it. And more generally, there are these ideas, for example, by Andy Clark, for example, about extended cognition, that we externalize our mind into the world constantly. For example, if I make a note that will help me remember something later that one of the other speakers said, that is a form of externalizing my cognition into the world, onto the world, and creating if you want to call it space, but the environmental conditions that support me optimally, right? So absolutely, I would say that based on my definition, intuition, we are not separable from the environment and from the space we find ourselves in. What do you think?
Definitely, I think so too. And I think it's also a whole complex system, right? Maybe you can put not the next slide, but the one after. Is there something appearing for you? You actually don't see any slides. Yeah, but it's for them, right? No, not this one, the one above. But I think it's not connected, right? Do you see anything on the screens? It is, okay, good. So what I already said, so we are more on the mental health issues, and we see that within cities, the more urbanized they are, we see a bit of, if it goes above 60% of urbanization, we see higher levels of common mental health diseases, though then we talk about depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, and they tend to go up the higher the urbanization, so actually the less space there is. And I think we see the individual, and I think you would probably agree, not only in the space that we see, but also the social space, right? This is a kind of another dimension of space, which I think is very important, because you are different, you behave differently, you get different feedback, you process in your brain things differently depending on if you feel safe socially and also, of course, physically in an environment. If you would be very aggressive to me right now, my stress levels would increase, and I would stutter and don't remember things. So the social space is also, I think, a very important aspect. And then, of course, you have the urban global space that influences both the person and the social space, so how people interact with each other. So if you would, facilitate that you would be a hub that you could intervene, right? And I think all that together influences, our brain and couples back, then you get this kind of feedback loops. So you have the urban space, you have the social space, and your kind of personal space, in a sense.
Yeah, if I can build it up, maybe you can go to one of the slides. I don't remember which one you kept in. Yeah, this one, for example, or this one, this new topology is even better. The previous one? No, the other previous? No, another previous? No, that's also nice, but I'll say, stop. Yeah, that one. This is, of course, still an artist's impression, but I think it captures very much the kind of challenges that we see in practice, and where I think much of the conversation we are having is coming together, because due to the kind of constraints I just tried to mention just earlier, is that in practice there's this idea that we build new concepts. And is this recorded? Is it recorded? It is, all right. Well, so let me then be a little bit more diplomatic. So what it basically means that in practice, we know that the actual things we are building might not be as ideal for people living there as we might have wished otherwise. And to pinpoint it, that means that it is especially vulnerable for the elements which we consider essential for the social space, for feeling secured, for restorative environments, especially between the high rise of high density buildings. And those are things which are, and I think that's what you, maybe in the beginning, if I understood correctly, that's quite difficult to measure, to say, hey, this is important for people because, yeah, it's to some respect subjective and all of that. But at the same time, it has to stand in an arena where at some point, and I'll make it very practical now, at some point there's in each building project this moment of austerity. Yeah, that we had all these ambitions and then actually the war in Ukraine is there, there's energy prices go up, so therefore we have to let go of some ambitions. And what you see is the things which are mandatory, like the energy performance or the things you can put in numbers, they stay on the table. If you want to keep on the table what is important for people, it's much harder. Because it's much more like, yeah, we like people to meet. Yeah, meet in your own time. So it's, and then you have these new topologies where it's not clear where then do you create meeting spaces. Is it only in the entrance room? And then we have these new mobility solutions, which in this example creates huge parking spaces for bikes. So how does it, coming home in a parking space for bikes, 600 bikes, so how does it feel, and do you then feel secure to go out at night and all of that? So all these things which matters for the humans at the end is very difficult in the planning process to keep up, and that's why it's important. That's why we try with neuroarchitecture to get more of a better understanding, to articulate this in indications. I mean, it's not like general tools, but indications of the impact of the proposed design solutions on the actual experience of people.
I can just add something to that. I completely agree. And in my work, for example, something that's very relevant is cognitive decline. When you talk about memory, for example, then cognitive decline is the kind of applied component of that kind of work. And for example, Alzheimer's. And these are huge topics, right, in our society. There's a lot of money also, medical funds and so on in that kind of research. It's very relevant for our society. And that's, I think, also important to realize that, for example, when we design an environment, that, of course, different people orient differently in an environment, but also that this changes slightly over age, like as we age. For example, in the many young people orient relative to landmarks. They read like street signs and everything. So, for example, kind of a U.S. city block, for example, is very easy to navigate for them, because they can just read the street sign. If you cannot read extremely well anymore, then the city block design is very complicated for you because it all looks the same, right? So, for example, the geometry of it is very complicated. So one thing that we often see is that is in an aging population, for example, that they rely more on these kind of geometry cues, kind of how are the buildings organized relative to each other and so on. The point that I want to make is that it's first of all, the design is of course linked to how well we navigate, to our well-being in that environment, but also again that there is not kind of that the optimal layout of that environment is essentially determined by your metric that you're using. For example, well-being or productivity; these are not necessarily the same things, right? Society can be miserable but very productive, and vice versa, right? So just maybe you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I was just, I think, 2 years ago at the Academy for Neuroarchitecture at La Jolla in University of California, and we had there neuroscientists and architects in the room, and what strikes me in this, and then there were some examples, and they were mainly about office buildings. And the discussion we had there, all right, I mean, you're talking about high-end office buildings like Google, all of that. And that's nice, but what about the most vulnerable people in social housing? I mean, then there's much more complex, for multiple reasons why. It's much more complex to create environments for people to thrive in that. And I think I'm kind of curious, also in terms of what you meant about geometry, because we see, for example, that we build now also new complexes with large-scale complexes with very small houses. And one of the things in our research on living microlife is that we see that it matters a lot for people if their particular room is just rectangular, or that it just has a little knick, because then you can separate it into space and all of that. And then at what point is, and then one other question I just spoke with housing corporations is, how many people can you have on one entrance? And at what point does it become anonymous, and at what point doesn't it? And what is the spaces in between actually do? And we see, for example, we did interviews with some of these complexes, the maintenance, and much of the maintenance people come from the hotel world. So you see that back in the semi-public spaces between the apartments, which are, of course, should be free, and we should be able to clean within a number of minutes. So that decreases the amount of possibilities to articulate your own identity or whatever. So all of these things, I'm kind of wondering at what scale, at what moment is this matter of scale? Also, maybe what you were saying, like this matter of scale for the social space. What is like a tipping point from a cognitive science perspective? If I may also ask questions, I don't know if I'm allowed to. Sorry.
Yeah, I like a tipping point in how, because if I hear you, and also the amount of space you have, and I think you mentioned the susceptible people, like elderly, like maybe people that live in poverty, or I think also children are completely different, let's say not species, but they need a different space, right? So in urban planning, you need to take into account all these different people, and maybe later on I'd like to ask you, do you see differences in what they need, and is it good to house people together from different ages and different, or would you say no, it's better to have an area that has kids there, because then you can really focus on that, also urban space wise, but okay, that's a question for later. But I think a tipping point in the brain, then I think of course what you can handle, right, stress wise, and this is very personal. I think we can talk a lot about this, and then we come a bit into the stress realm, what stress does to your body. So I don't know if you're if I can talk a bit about stress. I like stress.
Sure, I'd like to hear some insight from like the kind of physiological
response
to
that,
stress.
because then it actually makes sense, right?
Of course,
so then
yeah.
you can, the way the body responds to stress is really nicely, this one could fit nicely. It's really well organized. We are well equipped to deal with stress. I think all of you know the main stress hormones, if you don't look at the slides, right? So we have adrenaline and we have cortisol. I think, give me a hand if you never heard about these two hormones. No, right? Okay. So what adrenaline actually does, this is what you need, and it kicks in very fast. We have noradrenaline, which is a neurotransmitter that works on our sympathetic nervous system. Well, you can forget that for today, but it's a very fast acting, and it's also a hormone that is released by the adrenal glands. So this adrenaline kicks in into your body if you have immediate stress, like if you see, I don't know, you walk in the city, you see a motorcycle coming your way and you have to jump. Or there's a dog and you have to run because it's aggressive and it will follow you. So the body is made in that sense. What do you need at that moment? You need energy, right? If you have to run, your muscles need energy. Your heart needs to pump faster because it is this energy and also the oxygen. You take in more oxygen, this goes to your muscles, and you're able to deal with this stressor. You need this energy at that moment. You're focused, you're only focused on one thing, that's the danger, right? This is how our body functions. Then there's a second wave of hormones, cortisol, and that actually helps the first wave, so you can continue longer. All the things that you do not need if you're stressed. You do not need to reproduce the moment you're stressed, right? You do not need to have to take care about your skin cells that might need some maintenance, or your bones, or whatever. So all of this is put on a lower level. Even your immune system is lowered. So if you're in stress, it's very functional, or your energy goes to the stress. You can run fight, flight, freeze, whatever, you can deal with the stressor. So it's very good that we have that. So I always say stress response is good until it goes on too long. And if we talk about urban spaces, you know, things that the whole time impinge on you, kind of give you continuous chronic stressors, then these, well, tools, physiological tools that we have in the body to deal with the stressors, they continue to be high for a longer time, right? We all say, oh, we have these high cortisol levels, and indeed, it's not good. If you have your cortisol peak, then it goes back, perfect. If it doesn't go back, if you keep on having these hormones in your body, what is happening? That you actually burn a lot of energy. This costs a lot of energy. You're tired, you're not sleeping well because you're in this wakeful state, and this is the chronic stress that I think we're talking about also, that a city can have chronic stress components that make you at one point have like a tipping point, if you want, and that you're, well, turning into a mental illness, mental disease. I don't know if that answers part of the what you were looking for.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think it's. I think again, going also back to what Matthias just said about the subjective experience of space, and of course what, for example, we have this green patch over there. Well, what we see in some of the designs now is that we say we have these high-density environment, and they are not in a stress sense, like that you're stressed because you see a motor, but maybe you're stressed because there's constant impulses, or it's more so anonymous that you're on edge because you never know what might happen. So either way, and
perceived stress, very
exactly.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea sometimes of those green patches in between, and we see it on many occasions, whether we call it courtyards or whatever, is that they create some sort of restorative environment. So you might be able to replenish from some of the stressors. But then it's, of course, the big question. So when does it create this feeling of being away, or where does it? And that's kind of still an open question. But what I'm intrigued also by is like this perceived stress, is that something which is more easily to replenish? That's actually one question. Another question is more like this accommodation. Like, could it be that, you know, if we even talk about the 80s of New York, there was this classic idea, people run there much faster. So I can imagine that there will be some sort of accommodation to the new kinds of stresses you have to deal with in a new environment. So at what point does it, in that sense, tip over?
Yeah, I will shortly answer and then give you the floor. I think perceived stress is very individual. So everybody perceives as also their environment. I can walk in the city and there are people all around it and I can be very happy. It doesn't stress me, it gives me energy. And somebody else feels like, oh my God, this is so crowded. I really don't feel well, I have to go home, right? So this is, I think the perceived stress is something very individual, and it really depends on how your the set points of your stress systems, let's say, and also what you have experienced, if you have experienced a lot of stress before in your life or after. So I think in that sense, and if you say, can we buffer these stressors, right? I think there are some studies, and you know better than me, I think, that if you have a lot of green spaces, this kind of buffers stress systems. Not like 100%, but you can have these things in the environment that make you feel more relaxed. So your stress levels kind of, well, normalize more easily. And I definitely think that in urban planning, we can have things there to I think there are also studies that show these kind of things. Also these hospital studies, if you have a view on the tree, you recover actually better. Treatment works better if you are in a safe and pleasant environment.
Yeah, following up on that, I wonder, what are the two questions? So, what are the things in terms of design, for example, city design, that are kind of generally, there's a consensus that this is good design and that it works for the most people? So kind of, what are the core elements of good design? And the other question, I guess, is, I assume that, you know, the way I do know that the way we orient, for example, it really, there's so many strategies of how we reorient, for example. And again, we can look at landmarks, we can look at geometry. People memorize routes. Some others just look out for a tower and then just kind of stay left of the tower, whatever. There's a million different ways of navigating, but also, I guess, extending that idea of strategies also to stress levels, for example. There's different ways of coping with stress, right? And probably at some point in our lives, we learned different strategies to cope with stress. And I do wonder, for example, when people move, depending on the strategies that they learned in their childhood, for example, what do they bring to a city? What kind of city do they end up choosing, for example? Where do they want to live? I can imagine that depending on that strategy, they want to live in a completely different city. Maybe this green space here is perfect for some people, but it's completely, it doesn't do anything to someone else, right? So these are, I guess, my two questions. What is the general good advice, good design? And the other thing is, how does the, for example, choice of a city depend on the kinds of strategies people have learned in their childhood?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and what we see, yes, there are some general principles that everybody now more or less agrees on, that it's important to create a good streetscape. Let me focus on the streetscape, like the spaces between buildings. That's where, of course, our society is produced. And which is not a nice add-on if you only have a house of 20 square meters. And you're not a student, but you actually start to build up your life, you're working, and then actually the outdoor spaces is a necessity because it's, well, you have such a small space. But I think one of the main thing is that we need a more human-skilled environment. And that's like as a response to the modernistic 1960s, 1970s buildings where we had car parking on the ground floor, where we had concrete, what we then, architects then called honest materials, but which were not so tangible and not so embracing. So you see across the board a lot of agreement that we should more make our environments more human skilled. And that's where it becomes complicated when you build in new high densities. And so what you see, for example, is that they say on eye level we should have like an active ground floor. We should create what we call an urban wall. So not, if we have high-rise, not directly at the street, but create an urban wall in between, which is more or less referring to the way we are used in the 19th century cities or classical cities idea. It has to be more vertical and horizontal rhythm, using green, getting car parking off the street. But at the same time, these are all design solutions which are actually borrowed from our 19th century cities, or they are borrowed from examples we looked at in Vancouver or Toronto or Seoul. So the question is, do they actually work here as intended? And there it becomes a challenge, because as it is a new topology, we don't know yet. So that's where, and that's also where each of the projects, each of the new plannings is situational, because it has this generally like this triangle or rectangular space where they have to solve all the buildings. So that means that, yeah, there's not one solution for an active perimeter you can do everywhere, because sometimes your street is 200 meters or sometimes only 50. And that's where it becomes interesting for the design. But also the essential question, if you do it wrong, then it can be quite horrible. And I think we all know spaces which we feel like we don't want to be here. We don't have a clear reason why, but we want to move away there. And others which we linger much longer than we used to. And until now, much of the research has been done, for example, by Jan Geil and others, but also by Christopher Alexander and the later researchers. And they all looked at our historical cities, like the city parks that almost all of us love. But I think that's nice, but that doesn't say that it will work in new urban areas with much more in the periphery with a new kind of setup. So I think that's where, yes, we know what to do, but if it works as we intend to do, that's exactly one of the big challenges.
Yeah, and different spaces might work for different things, right? I think this building is a nice example. It is open, it's nice to work around it, but honestly, to have a symposium here in this hall, I'm always like, it's not ideal, right? It's difficult to hear, you're not focused, everybody's walking around. Some people say it's no problem, but for some people it would be like, this is not a nice space for me to listen to a story or follow a discussion, right? So I think also spaces, we have to think about why do we make spaces in this different, I don't know, in a building or in an area? What do we aim with that space? What can people do here? And do we organize things for this space specifically, right?
No, that's absolutely true, and that's where also that's why I said social housing or affordable housing, to make it a little bit wider. That's where you have a lot of constraints financially. You have a lot of demands, as I just said earlier. So there are a lot of challenges how to make something out of that. Well, which is not the most ideal version, which you would do if you would have an infinite amount of money to spend if you make the headquarter for Google. So that means that and that's where also the challenge is, and what you said about where you want to live, but in the current housing situation, and it's not limited to Amsterdam, I think it's all big cities. It's not so much as where do you want to live, but where can I afford to live? And so that means that we force people in spaces that they have to live probably much longer than they ideally like to. And that means that, yeah, there's the question, and so they have to cope with that space, so to say. And then at this moment of the design, this moment of realization, then it's important to have at least some more tangible ideas for that particular design. What then at least, like if the corridor should be a little bit wider, so it can be also a social space, or that you have a lobby, which is not just a lobby for people who are extroverts. I think one of the things I'm very intrigued by is that we always think about people like extroverts. We also had this Living the Microlife as a student project, and some of them, a Berlin guy, he said, yeah, we should force people that they go there. And I said, yeah, well, my son is quite of an introvert, so I learned up close that it's not necessarily ideal for all sorts of people. So also there, this idea of social space is very much a construct, which is, I think, something which also needs much more deeper understanding and differentiation.
I just want to add something. So when this is more of a personal anecdote, but when I moved to Amsterdam, I came from DC, from Washington DC, and I moved to Amsterdam. And so I had to organize my move and everything while being abroad. I had to find an apartment without being able to visit and everything. And so this question about, for example, what can I afford? For me, it was much more general than, let's say, money. Yes, money is absolutely important. For example, because Amsterdam is an expensive city, at least for an assistant professor salary, I can share it's still an expensive city. So now I decided to move to the Rivierenbuurt. I know some of you may know it. It's a nice area, but it's also pricier, right? But the decision was, at the end of the day, about what can I afford. And I noticed that I cannot afford being outside the city when I don't have a social network here, for example. I don't have, I need a good connection, for example, to work. I need a good kind of just, even without knowing what I will get into in my life in Amsterdam, but I need to be able to have many options. And so spending more money on cutting down time, first of all, that is definitely something I learned in the US, where the metrics shift. People, in the US, people spend a lot of money on just reducing time. It's like someone else should do that work. That kind of attitude, I think, is very prevalent in the US, I noticed. And while it's not entirely my nature, I guess, but I did learn a lot from that attitude, at least. And I noticed moving to Amsterdam, what I could afford was, unfortunately, the more expensive apartment. Because my metric of what I can afford, essentially my well-being was more important than money. And so I think that is also, just in a way, it goes back to the point about strategy and how can I set up my life in a way that works for me, right? So yeah, just wanted to share that, more of a personal anecdote.
Yeah, and I think it also relates back to the notion of space has multiple layers. We have design, but we also have all the social aspect. And I think I was wondering, like, how difficult it might also be to have type of architecture that work in a community and are like really well functioning within that reality, maybe because they respond well to the climate conditions and also to the geography of that place, and so the urban landscape is efficient in that case. And then you try to mimic exactly that dynamic into another space, and it's not working anymore. The people are different, and the streets are not working the same way. And so, to which extent can you actually study like how people will react to your to the space that you're kind of projecting? To which degree of certainty can you actually say this design that I'm preparing is gonna have this impact? And also, like maybe another question line is also, how can we understand that is the space that is causing stress? Because I think it's not the first thing that comes to my mind, especially. I tend to kind of maybe, if I'm stressed, I'm gonna think, I kind of associate that to specific events and not to the general conditions. So how do you make that distinction?
Yeah, I think definitely stress is something, it's an event, specifically if you have a major stressor, that what I just told that you have to deal with now, you have an exam coming up, you're super stressed, everything will be, you see it through this glass of being stressed in a sense. Where did I want to go to? So your question is, if you want, how do you get people to in a certain area? Because I think you cannot design the area and be sure, okay, I'd like to have only climate-aware people so that I can make it work. I think you have to find general spaces that work for everybody, so that the space directs you to a certain feeling or behavior that facilitates it, right? You cannot ask people, say, yeah, you have to do it like this. If it's rule-based, it doesn't normally work. I think the environment should be inviting. This is more your...
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge how to in the design phase, how then to get an indication or a likelihood of what is the impact of the design on way we enable people to live there and spend time there. And I think in our research we try to do triangulation of different kind of methods. But one of the things we did an experiment with is also the question how you can test it more earlier. To say simple, you can say, okay, what kind of design solutions are applied, and can you see that back in the lab with eye tracking and valuing questions, and also if it is just recently built with field research. So you can try to knit that together to see an indication whether it likely is going to work in which kind of dimensions. But it becomes, I still think, challenging is also to see, can you already test it in a design phase? So imagine like it's a design, whether it's computerized or with hand. And so there, one of the questions we are starting to ask is, how much can you, because designers, they make always nice artist impressions, so then you always have some sort of balloon there and people on laptops and drinking tea and all of that, so it's all happy. So, but if you want to test it, that is not the thing you want to test, because then people look at people and therefore you cannot see whether it works best. So what we try to do, how can you deconstruct a space to its elements, like you said at the beginning, like this box, like what are the basic geometrical shapes, and maybe some differentiations on that do represent or are to some respect trigger the same kind of visual response as maybe an actual photo or a more detailed level of design. Because if you start to get a better understanding of that, then it becomes something which can also be get a place in the design process itself. And right now it's much more about like self-reporting. You know, do you like this space? Yeah, I think I like it. Whether we know that, of course, the subconscious experience of that space is for great detail much more of impact on.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on availabilities in a neighborhood, right? I don't know, I think we talk about buildings and space and green spaces between buildings, but it's also, is there, I don't know, a bakery that you can get your bread in the morning? I think this kind of creates, if we talk about space, also, well, you talked about time and money, but also time, right? Time is also a space. If we can create these small interactions with people, I think there's research done on that. If you have, even if you don't know the other one, right? It's not a friend. We know that social support is super important for stressors. But even if you have encounters with people in the neighborhood, this tends to be, not for everybody, but tends to be seen as very positive. So I think in urban planning, we also put that into account. Is there a space to exercise in the neighborhood? Is there indeed a bakery? Is there some? Yes, you create a space where people meet each other and not only run to their work, and not necessarily you have to meet and you have to talk and you have to drink coffee with each other. It can also be like a neighborhood something, but also these kind of small things, the facilities in the neighborhoods, I think are also important to feel it's your home and to feel like a safe space.
I think a term that is really important here is the term affordance. What does the space afford, right? And this is a very important concept, I think, in cognitive neuroscience, certainly. And I find that concept in general very, I find it beautiful for multiple reasons. So here's just a small anecdote. So when you put people, if you put someone in an empty room and you give them a buzzer, and when they hit the buzzer, they get an electric shock, a lot of people would hit that buzzer because it's just so boring in that room, they will start shocking themselves. If you give a second person that same shock, but they don't have control over the buzzer, they will have a terrible experience. Objectively measured, you could say they get the same shock, right? You could say, well, the same shock equals the same experience, but that's absolutely not true. They have completely, fundamentally different experiences. So that is one takeaway from that little anecdote. And the other thing is that it also, and this is true for my life in general, which is why also I chose to move to Amsterdam and not somewhere outside to have a bigger place or whatever. It's really about, I think the conditions that at least I find myself in, they're almost less important than my feeling of having control over those conditions. I need options, right? I can be happy being a monk on a mountain without any possessions if I chose that. And I could be absolutely miserable in a golden cage with everything that I would ever ask for. So it's really about options, and that again, this goes back to affordances. What does the environment that I find myself in, that I created, what does it afford me? And I think that's essentially a city designer. I'm not a city designer, I'm a neuroscientist, but from a personal point of view, I'm looking for environments that afford things to me. So that's one way why I find it interesting. From a more really kind of talking about consciousness, about the actual phenomenological experience, from that point of view, I also find affordance very interesting because it is, let's say, the affordance of the Amstel, whether I can go through it or not, it doesn't depend only on the Amstel. It also depends on me, whether I can swim or not. So the affordance is not a property of the environment, it's not a property of me either. It's directly in the interaction, right? And that I find a very interesting concept. There are not so many concepts, at least in neuroscience, that are this kind of, what I guess some people call it transjective. It's not separating the world into subject and object, but the affordance is a concept that directly describes how you are embedded and how you relate to the environment that you find yourself in, and that I find just fascinating.
Yeah, just to add to your the control and predictive, right? And this we know from stress research in human research, but also in animal research, that indeed, even if you would prefer to have a big shock, but you control it, than to have smaller shocks that you do not control, right? So it hurts less, but okay, if I can control it, I have it now, and then I know the next half an hour I won't get any shocks anymore. I would prefer that. So I think people can handle a lot of stress, actually, depending on whether it's predictable and if they have a certain amount of control over it. This is like hugely important. Also, if you have control over a situation, even slight control, right? Or you have a choice, not too much choice, then you have the choice paradox that if you have too much choice, you can get completely stressed out of it. I think our students have that now. You can do so many things that it's like, okay, what do I choose? But to have a certain degree of control is super important to be able to deal with the environment. So I think that is also something to, well, maybe take along in planning.
May I ask, I'm curious because you also said about the intertwinement between observer and the actual observed, so to say. And you said it's like constituted within the interaction. So then, I'm kind of curious because then can you tell a little bit more on then how you still research it?
Yeah, so you center the entire approach on the experience of the participant, not on anything that is objectively measurable. Whatever you experience, let's say we could be sitting here right now and all of these people here, they walk up the same stairwell, right? Maybe one of them has had a traumatic experience in their life that gets activated right now as they walk up this stairwell. They have a very different experience of walking up this stairwell right now. So, and that is the ground truth. That is the ground truth for them, and to describe their brain activity, their behavior, their cognition. That is ground truth. There's nothing objective in that sense about the experience of space. I could close my eye. I have very strong visual imagery, for example, which is also why I'm interested in studying it. It's also a pursuit of understanding that myself. But yeah, I can close my eyes right now and still see the stairwell. It is this, you research it by centering the approach on the experience. And the question then is, how do you measure the experience? And there is no, I don't have a good answer. The way I try to do it is I let actually people describe their experience. So they talk into a microphone the way I do it right now, what their experience is like. And for example, you and I later describe how our experience was being at this event, right? And you can transcribe that to text and then use text analysis to compare how similar was your report of your experience to my report of my experience. And you can link that to, let's say, our measures of neural activity or our measures of eye tracking, of our gaze behavior during that experience. And you can try to at least approach phenomenology in that way by having these physiological measurements, by behavioral measurements, and then really trying to that's the beauty of doing work in humans, at least. We can actually ask people about their experience. It's still a readout. It is not measuring the experience itself. We may both call that blue-ish. Blue. I'm not sure whether you see it the same way as I do, but at least it's approaching that topic. But in order to do that, then you really need to kind of let go of also a bit of the comfort of that 3D box that we believe we all are in. Because if you really center the approach on the experience that we're having, then there is at least less shared. We are not in the same perceptual reality. It's utterly unique, and that is, I think, at least I noticed when I thought this, sometimes I find myself almost afraid of that, right? So there's a certain comfort in having a shared experience with other people. And letting go of that, the resolution of it is that there is an appreciation of how beautiful it is that I have this experience right now, and it's utterly unique and it's beautiful. I wish you could have my experience right now. I wish I could show you how it is. I wish I could see yours. But that is that's how we do the work. We try to let people actually describe the experience and link it to their neural and behavioral measures.
Yeah, and I think on top of asking people what they experience, I think because you can also reason a lot, right? And have a lot of things about, I think I experienced it like that. And then if you, at the same time, look at their behavior, how they are approaching people, what they are doing, right? I think that together gives a very nice, and maybe even biological measures in a setting that you make in the lab, that you try to make a comparable situation. I think all of these things together, but specifically also how people behave, and then not only on an individual level, right, but also on a group level, and how people interact with each other, and how that influences group dynamics, which then couples back to the individual and shapes its experience in, right? Because I think it's very useful to ask people, and we can ask people about their experience, but as from the biological side, I always like to see more, because it's not only the experience, it is influenced by others, and so I think that is very interesting to go there, to have this more person in its social and spatial environment, and then see indeed how this affects personal experiences and how this affects...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But for example, when you think of stress, right? So let's say if someone is stressed in an environment, there's no one else who could ever decide that that's how you say, that this is not valid or something. Yeah. That's not true. If they are stressed in an environment, they are stressed in that environment. That is true to them. And there's no objective measure that would ever change that, right? So that's kind of the point that I'm making. It is, and that goes even to even just this kind of the perception of that 3D box. It's not even about stress. I think my point is that any experience is inherently subjective, even the one of just this kind of 3D space around us. There's nothing of course, we assume we all live in the same, we share this kind of 3D space, but our experience of it is still subjective. And that is relevant at least to describe my brain activity, my behavior in that moment, and what kind of, at the end of the day, what kind of city I will live in, my well-being, all of these things that we try to quantify about people, they are centered on the experience. There's nothing objective about well-being in that sense. Again, I could be miserable in a golden cage, and I could be very happy without any possessions. But so there's nothing. Anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make.
I think I follow you, and I can imagine that on this individual level, that is the actual, as you call it, truth. I'm just also wondering then, is there at some point still some sort of generalization possible? And what we do in our research, that we do accept that there are many limitations to how you can measure how people experience spaces and which kind of design elements are actually taking part in that. But it does, I think, to some respect still, what you also said earlier is the interesting part is also from that, so what does it actually mean for how we then make, at that particular moment in time, decisions about how we design the spaces. And I think one example that comes to mind is we did a research on the NESM Wharf. It's in the north of Amsterdam, and that is one of the, you have this little ferry going there, and it's one of the areas which has been contested by a lot of what they called out-Noorderlingen, so people living in Noord and say, we feel this is gentrification. What is this part doing here? We used to be a labor neighborhood, and why on earth are these Juppen coming here? And when we talked with the municipality, the designers about that, so one of the questions we did there, so does it matter if you experience that space at the moment that you are a passerby, at the moment you're a passerby and you are from out north, or you're a passerby and you are just visiting there, or if you are living there? So does it, to some respect, influence the way we perceive space? And can we see whether which kind of elements which are in that space still could, I'm thinking now we didn't do that, but that we should have done, is ask actually the question, so to what respect does this space also afford a feeling maybe of agency by people from out north, and where does that actually materialize or constitute? You talked about a bakery. It's always also a very interesting question in neighborhoods. We don't have much functions anymore we can place because people buy online. There are no small bakeries. There's even libraries get scaled up to larger. So that's always the question we have with house corporations. Where do we put our money that we know it costs us money, but it's important for the people living there? And so how far can you stretch, like also in distance, kind of functions, and still creating therefore a feeling of agency by different kind of people?
Yeah, and I think it's like you mentioned before, a lot of time it's about money, right? So in a big architectural designing of a new part of the city, how much budget is actually reserved for thinking about well-being of the people? I don't know, actually.
Well, I think I can't answer that in specific. What you see is that in the beginning, you have a lot of ambitions, and certainly the people who are going to live there are very high on that list. Then of course in the calculations that are made in the first phase, it's like a rough numbers, like these are the kind of investments we take, and then it goes through multiple phases before it's actually constructed in different, built in different phases. So you make a whole plan for the Sluisbuurt, and then only the first patch is going to be built. And of course there are many ideas there about, that's a good example where you have also some activities on the ground floor, which should be affordable for people. And maybe if I make a U-turn, a better example I can bring from Rotterdam, because what they see there is that, yes, it is important for people that we have, for example, cultural activities on the ground floor, and you have in Vienna a good example that they say, as a municipality, the whole ground floor is basically keep being owned or controlled by the government, and therefore we are able to have also cultural activities in there, or maybe little bakeries for non-market prices. But then it becomes a legal element, because that is difficult to demand a collective good and then let the individual investors pay for that. That's a complicated issue. But they found their way by saying, hey, that is only possible in the so-called first agreement that they sign, the anterieure overeenkomst, it's a legal term. That's only way at the beginning. And what they experimented with in Rotterdam is that they say, if we do that by private law, we can demand that at the end of that also after the buildings are sold, still our agreement that we make there affordable spaces for non-commercial functions, for example, enforceable. And that is, once you pass that phase, you didn't do it, you can't do that anymore. So that's why we always like to traverse between the more neuroarchitecture research, but also this governance kind of qualities. Like, when do you need to secure it? And that is, well, one of the, I would say struggles, challenges, opportunities we still have. And that's where you need this kind of knowledge to prove, hey, but it is important, because if you cannot make it provable, then it's nice to have and it falls easily off the table. That was a very long answer, how much money I could, but I couldn't.
No, but I think that is the thing, right? And I know some research, even if it goes the other way around, like on substance abuse, if you can buy your bottle of alcohol on every corner of the street, actually rates go up in this part of the area. So it is something about availability, right? It goes into the negative and in the positive way.
I was also thinking about the notion of transitory spaces, those spaces that are meant to be just leading fluxes of people, and also the spaces that are meant to just let people kind of actually live. And in cities nowadays, there are so many people that nobody's gonna be kind of just staying in one place. Nobody's gonna, even residential areas of the city are kind of still meant to just vehiculate like fluxes of people, and vice versa. So how do we kind of bring together two things? Like, how can like a place of transition also just kind of can allow people to just pass without harming those that are actually going to stay? And how do you find a balance for just making something that is going to be appreciated by a visitor and by a local?
You mean the tourists that invade Amsterdam and then the locals are very unhappy with it, or this kind of...
Yeah, sort of. But even within the same city, I think there are certain areas and districts that are going to use this in different ways, and people coming from the suburbs are going to just pass through Amsterdam without the intention, and like their kind of goal of just passing through those streets doesn't have to kind of be harmful for the people living there, and vice versa. Yeah. So.
If I may, I think I think it ties into a couple of interesting developments, because within many of our cities we like to decrease the amount of cars being used because of air pollution, noise, safety and so on. But the alternative is, for example, that we say people should use more public transport or bikes or whatever. And you see that in some of the densification of our cities, we say we want to build around public public transport nodes. So because there's already a public transport and you can easily build around it. But that exactly is where this challenge comes about, because there needs to be the functionality of the transit, of the people who just have to get their train on time or their metro or whatever. And that's a whole different kind of affordances that the space should have for them. Then if you are, it needs to be clear, you need to know where to go, you need to have clear signage and all of that. And then if you want to try to have a more stitching and gluing kind of space that people are lingering longer, or then there might be some water thing around it and some benches. And so that is like an interesting tension field on multiple levels, because we have, for example, now benches which are made that you cannot lie on it. So we avoid homeless people lying on the benches. It's a very intriguing moral question, by the way. Or have a little stitches that they feel very uncomfortable. Whereas as a city, and of course as Amsterdam, for example, we have a huge amount of elderly people in the years to come. So they need benches in order to move from different directions to different directions, from different places to other places. So yeah, that is something which is intriguing also in the sense of science, because you have a lot of traffic scientists, or like Serge Hoogendoorn in the TU Delft. He has a huge group about how people move through space, but very traffic oriented. And then there's more like the other domain where you think about the importance of green for restorative environments, or you have a different. So I think that is still something where a lot of interaction and transfer knowledge and collaboration is needed.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And I think in a neighborhood or in the city, you need certain things. They are indispensable, right, for people. They need to get either out of the area with their car or with public transport. They have to put their kids at childcare. If that's not going to happen, this is a basic need, then they cannot go to their work, they cannot function, right? And so it's always, I think, a balance between, okay, what is absolutely necessary in this area, the money, where we have money from, and I think the welfare around it, the mental well-being, often comes in the last place, right? If we have this covered, we have some money left, we can make some green spaces. I know this is the thing that and maybe, yeah, we should rethink that.
Yeah, if I may add on that, we did a project about nature-inclusive city development, and was very happy that we finally had a collaboration with 4 schools or with ecologists from different kinds. If you ask them what is needed, then you understand why we don't produce it, because they all have a different opinion. And what is interesting in that is that you know it, like, you know, for what you need for nature might be something else than you might need for people. But what it showed is that that again, if you're not able to articulate and make very tangible what is needed, like also with when I think about these green patches here, so do they need to make sure that you don't see all the buildings? Should they be able to, that you are being away, or should be more looking green? So if we have not a clear idea of what is actually important or what might be the most important, then it's very difficult to hold up. But that is also something which is still needs a lot of research in order to understand how it actually works and which things are more likely to work better than other things.
But not research in the sense we're going to build it like this and like this and compare, because that would be too expensive, right? So I guess that you would then do is compare cities, right? I heard somebody once talk about Almere, which nobody wants to live, but apparently the architecture of Almere is very nice, and it's very pleasant to live there. This is at least what I heard from the start. I don't know if that is also your experience, but it was really thought through that it would be pleasant to live there. So I imagine that you kind of grab all these cities together and then try to do research there, instead of like building one city like this and then like this and then compare it like in a controlled way.
Yeah, I think this is also where it touches into what you were saying. Like Almere was designed by the idea that we could create a space which is creating the fortresses for optimal experience. Yeah. So there was like this belief of that we knew how to do it, and of course the response to that is that we have created more spaces which are not separating all the modes of transport. That green is nice, but also can be very unsafe for people. That it's, you know, all these things change, and that is a little bit of how spatial design and urban design works, is that it is responding to the needs of the moment, and to be a little bit more cynical, or what is en vogue at that moment. I didn't say that, but it is happening. It is like, and there's that's where like the difference is when you design a phone and you have the first prototype, you can show it and you can test it, and you say there's no home button, and I still don't add it, but still you can test it. But that's the difference with the new typologies, that it's being built, and then we experience if it actually does what we thought it would do, and that's where that's where we try at least to make, in a very modest way, some inroads. And that's why I think there's different kinds of sciences that we need in order to, well, at least, and I'm now thinking about your experience remark also, is to let people understand how they could actually experience it without even saying, and therefore it's wrong or therefore it's right, but even the experience itself might evoke an understanding where actually their design might lead or might go.
Yeah, I think it's also a big challenge, for example, when you redesign a city and update it and modernize and everything. That's a completely different challenge, for example, than designing a city from scratch, right? So your phone example, when they designed the iPhone, for example, the mentality was not, how do we make existing phones better? The question was, what should a phone be? And then they ended up killing the kind of the keys, and came up with a kind of a virtual keyboard. And 2 years later, everyone had that. So, but the mentality was, what should a phone be, rather than how do we make the existing thing better? And I think, for example, modernizing a city like Amsterdam that has a long tradition, has a long history, is a very different challenge than designing a city from scratch. I noticed this also in Washington, D.C., again, where I lived for a while. This was a very different city. First of all, it's very young. It's designed as a capital. And in general, the experience of that city every single weekend was very different, because they created a city that is kind of a structure to host the entire society. But then every weekend, there's a different part of that society coming in. There's like one weekend you have a ginormous Black Lives Matters movement, tens of thousands of people come into the city and then they go out. The weekend after, you have the MAGA movement come in. The entire city changes appearance and vibe every weekend. Then you go out, and then you have the Pride March come in the next weekend. So for me, it's a very impactful experience actually to be in such an environment designed to host different aspects of society, but at different times even. And that's also again very kind of, I guess, something that I experienced there a lot is. A lot of the cities, they separate, for example, their affordances. This is the area where you go shopping. This is the area where you live. This is the area where the cafes are also, but it's not...
This is where you demonstrate, right?
It's like this is there, and this is there, and this is there, and then you drive your car in between places, right? So it's a completely different structure. It's a completely different structure and a completely different way of life. And yeah, DC really made me appreciate that city design also, because when you go to DC and you're there for a weekend, for example, you really only experience DC at that moment. And a weekend afterwards, it's a very different city. That's my experience of it, at least, yeah. So, I guess turning that into a question, what do you, from your experience, for example, what are the differences between designing a city from scratch versus modernizing an existing city like Amsterdam?
Well, then for my professional experience, not in your research kind of experience.
Yeah, your professional experience.
Although that could be the same.
I guess both of you have way more connections also to in your work at least to the environment, to design, to the environmental conditions, to stress, for example. What are the environmental conditions that cause a certain stress response, for example? Seeing the other side of the design side of things, this is something that, for example, I don't have in my professional life, at least.
Well, I think the new cities that are designed, that happen, of course, in China, lately much more than, I think, in many European countries, if any. And yeah, of course, they had particular ideas, and if you even go back in history, some of them, like from the Mormons, they had this idea of heaven, and they represented how they designed the grid and how they made it. So you have like different kind of traditions of making a city. If you're in Vienna, you had, of course, the emperor, which had this idea about how the cities, and and of course in the Netherlands, it's again also a different kind of culture. We're more entrepreneurial and less with the king, so you see that also reflected. But right now, what is different in it's almost a mixture actually, because what we try in each project, each spatial project. What needs to be added there is almost a city in itself. It's almost like, so it's not so much of, we also do projects in existing neighborhoods, but this is like newly built within the existing neighborhood. So it's like carving out this triangle, and here we build something else. And that has to respond to the right environment around it, but in itself, it should be able to function. And that is almost like, and there's not one paradigm anymore, like in the modernistic period, that people said we should do it like this, like we should have these kind of buildings, this kind of, it's much more diverse right now. And that's, I think, a very interesting thing, but also challenging, because that's where I made a comparison with the iPhone. That's where actually each of those projects might be a new iPhone, but then even the question whether it's a phone or not. So it's built and constructed in a way that hasn't been done, well, really the same way before. So that means it's like a prototype to some respect. And that's challenging.
Yeah, and I think also it's an interesting question, like if you renovate or if you build from scratch, you can indeed integrate all of that. And I think coming back to the inspraak, right, that people have a say about it, I think if you renovate an area and you ask people what do you need, and they feel some kind of agency over what is being done, they will be much more happier, even if you do exactly the same thing, right? So that, in a sense, is something, why also that is taken into account, I think.
Sorry, I have to jump in and say that unfortunately we only have around 5 minutes left, so I think we should open the floor to questions from our audience.
Could have done that before.
Yeah. 5 minutes, people.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm an interior designer specialized in architecture psychology, so I'm really well involved in some of these thematics. I would like to ask how much you think neuroarchitecture is actually involved in the design process, and if it is like a constant collaboration with municipality and institution, or is still related to very punctual intervention in problematic area of the cities.
I think I'll take this. Well, thanks for your question. I think I'm not quite sure if I understand it correctly. You said, is architecture like leading in a sense when you do these interventions in socially, economically deprived neighborhoods? Or is it more collaboration, or even just a small piece of the whole planning process by governments?
Yeah, I would like to understand if it's like, if there is actually a full attention to the outcome or research of neuroarchitecture. So it's a constant recognition from municipality, developer, consultancy, a constant consultancy in development of cities, or is still some consultancy that is related to specific intervention in problematic areas. I would like to understand how much you are involved in the whole process of designing cities.
Yeah, I'm doing research, so at the end of the day, it's on, of course, the consortium partners, architects, urban designers, to do something with it or not. But what we see is that it's still quite a new development, new field with a lot of more questions sometimes than answers. So it's well, we just have a new grant proposed, which had a positive feedback now in the middle. And that's where we work together with 7 housing corporations and 4 municipalities, because they want to learn faster from those new prototypes in order to see what they can do in their own projects. And then neuroarchitecture is just one piece of the analysis of that we aim to conduct. But what I think is also still a bigger challenge in this field, what I hear is that both the software to run the biometrics and to run the data coming out of an eye tracker or in a lab test is still very expensive for small medium enterprises, which design firms are. We see still also a lot of things still to my surprise, if anybody knows, please tell me, the impossibility to run really good eye tracking tests in VR environments. We did a couple of tests, and then it's a sphere, right? But then the data comes out in rectangles. So one of my research spent, I think, 2 weeks patching that all back together, and I thought that should be more doable because actually a triangulation, I would say. But it's and we work with iMotions from Boston. So we see that they're still in the sense of the materialization, but those technologies, it's still too much in its infants to really become something, without us doing anything, that it becomes something as a tool, maybe also in participation, but also in the planning process and practice itself. And I think that's something, I'm still also one of the research we try to do to see if we can find better tooling than that.
But I think in general there is more attention to it, right? So I think now when things are being rebuilt or planned, they actually also, municipalities have more we should have an urban planner there, or we should have somebody that it's also psychological urban, there's some kind of so that really gets someone involved from the start to address that. And I think that is coming up, right? Is more.
Yeah, if I may add one to that, Utrecht, for example, they have now also what they call a social architect. So that they say when we make a plan, the Merwedekanaalzone, for example, also Groningen has it, then we don't have only an architect or an urban designer evaluating it, but also somebody who looks at what does that mean for people. I think to my surprise, until now, that's mainly sociologist, but I would say that would be environment psychologist or actually as well, but that's a different field sometimes. It's also sometimes strangely enough.
Well, that is a new field, right?
Yeah.
That is pretty new, but I think they are being involved more and more. And then, of course, apart from that, if there is a difficult neighborhood, then they also try interventions, which is, of course, different. It's not always about urban planning. You have also these interventions that if you heighten the amount that people earn every month, right? You just give them €1,000 extra. It has a huge impact. So, I mean, you need a certain amount of money to survive, right? And stress and poverty, you can do whatever intervention you have. You need a certain amount of, way of organizing your life with some money. So I think in that sense, both is done. Both going to difficult areas, but also doing it from the start. It's more and more involvement of environmental psychologists, indeed. That's what I was looking for.
Thank you.
You have mainly talked about the urban neuroarchitecture, and I was wondering if you also look at the more internal designs of houses or specific structures. For example, the rehab center of Herzog and Dimmerow comes to mind, because they have specifically thought it to improve the well-being of the patients in the rehab center, and it personally would interest me as well how much the design and architecture of a building impacts the well-being of people. So more on a smaller scale rather than urban. Do you look at that?
Yeah, what I know, but I'm not an architect, but I know that they did experiences also in hospitals with the colors of the walls, for example, if you do it a light blue or a white, and also if you put bars that people can hold on, because if they come to the hospital, that might be a bit shaky. So all these things add to the well-being, also because people feel like, they thought about me, they thought about how I came in here, and also the desk that people are. If you have there was this hospital that had a very high desk, so people really had to look like this to make their appointment. And actually, if you make it a desk that is face-to-face, and also have a specific desk for children coming in, that they can look at they felt much better. So all these, it feels very small, but it can have a big impact. And I think more and more, people start to think about these things before they just build it as cheap as possible. And
I think maybe there's also, if you see the proceedings of the Academy of Neuroarchitecture at the University of California, they had, I think it started much more on the inside research, and mainly in the health perspective, of course. Also quite frankly, always very small numbers of test persons, like 5 or so. So it was always like, yes, very, very small, surprisingly small, I would say. But that you see, and I think Harvard was one of the first who also brought it more to the outside, to the public space, and that's where we also collaborated with, because that's the complexity of public space is that, of course, the amount of variables explodes, because you have so many variables at play in different seasons, so in the inside it used to be much more of a, well, to some respect less complex environment, but basically mainly also related to hospitals or care homes or something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The discussion was super interesting, and thank you to our audience. Our next event will be on Friday, the 6th of June. In it, we would like to create an interdisciplinary panel to discuss the topic of innovation and society, analyzing it from different perspectives. We will start from the movie Metropolis from 1927 and move it forward with an analysis of technology, the implications or opportunities, and our dependence on it. Just like almost 100 years ago, the question on whether machines and innovation are actually doing more harm than good to the society still remains crucial and unanswered.
Yeah, so we'll probably see you there, and in the meantime you can always check our website. We are kind of updating it with recent information, such as our recruitment campaign for all the new students who are like interested in what we're doing. They can either discover more about that and eventually also kind of join us. So we hope you had a nice 1 hour and a half with us, and see you next time, hopefully. Yeah, thank you.